Good afternoon from Oxford and welcome to another FT Live session here at the Future of the Car Summit, and good morning, good evening, wherever else you are in the world. So, as I said, my name is Amanda Stratton. I'm going to be moderating this panel. I would like to, before we get started, just remind you that you can, of course, post questions to the panel throughout the session using the chat function that's on your screen, and we will endeavour to answer as many of those as possible as the session goes on. And also, just to share any thoughts or comments that you have about the whole event using the hashtag FTLive. Now, this session is titled Carbon Crackdown, Reducing the Lifestyle Carbon Footprint in the Car Industry. Now, it's well known that, of course, there has been pressure on car makers to reduce emissions dramatically, and there is a lot more to come in the coming years. Now, whilst we've seen these massive reductions in tailpipe emissions, production emissions, which could reach as much as 60% of life cycle emissions by 2040, are set to rise. Now, what can OEMs and their partners do to reduce the greenhouse gas emission impact of the materials that are used in cars? And I'm thrilled to introduce the panel that I have with me today to discuss this. First of all, we have Fredrika Klarén, who's the head of sustainability from Polestar. Welcome to you. Guillaume, who's the VP of Transportation and Mobility at Dassault Systèmes, joining us from Tokyo. And Erika Ilves, who's the head of strategy at the Metals Company. Welcome to all of you. Fredrika, I would just like to start with you. As an OEM, Polestar, where does sustainability start?
For us, it starts at the drawing table, and Polestar is really about design, technology, sustainability, and we believe that the combination of those three is really our biggest strength. And we also know that it takes the dedications of designers and engineers to produce or to draw or develop a product to make it as sustainable as possible. They have to really dig into the material choices, the supplier choices, the way we construct the car in order to have a product that actually improves society. That is what we at Polestar aim to do with what we do.
And do you, as a relative newcomer into the OEM market, does it help that you are new, that you aren't burdened with a big legacy?
I mean, we come into this market with fresh ideas and all of the insights of being formed in a time where we have so much knowledge about how a business can impact sustainability. So we have a really powerful start, I think, when it comes to building our brand on sustainability and setting clear goals from the start. And we really want to tap into 4 key drivers for sustainable development that we believe in. Climate neutrality, of course, but also circularity, transparency, and inclusion.
Now, you talk about transparency. How important is it to you?
It's the holy grail for me as a sustainability professional. I know that transparency is a key driver for all sustainability issues. It's not a silver bullet, but it really enables accountability, following through. For example, when it comes to really having an impact on what we're going to discuss today, the carbon footprint of a car, we need to understand the supply chain of that car, and transparency will enable us to take action where we need to take action. And for example, we have started utilizing blockchain to create traceability in order to increase transparency for that reason. So I see it as a really a prerequisite for climate action also. We cannot only talk about our climate targets on a company level or a product level. We also have to be really transparent on that journey. And for that reason, we also really like to talk about what is the carbon footprint of our existing models. And I think we're going to get into it later, but we have this moonshot goal that we've created for ourselves, Polestar Zero. We know that we need to take really strong action on decarbonizing the industry within this decade. We cannot wait. So at Polestar, we wanted to create a sense of urgency and decided that we need to create a climate neutral car by 2030 in order for us to really pursue solutions that will decrease the emissions within this decade. And while doing so, we wanted to use transparency as a way to really build trust in what we're doing and to get the consumer to join in and really be inspired by what we do. So we also decided to launch a product sustainability declaration where you as a consumer can see the footprint of the car and also other relevant sustainability data. Today we include also the traced risk materials that we have in the car. So I think transparency is key for many sustainability issues and especially climate action, I would say.
Guillaume, sustainability obviously is important to everybody. What are the different sustainability priorities then that we see from private customers versus companies and mobility operators? Is it different or are there similarities?
I think that there has been a change in the paradigm of, I would say, in the paradigm of three dimensions, and those three dimensions are as important for customers, but also for mobility operators, for companies. And I think today we are at a tipping point when you have a converging, I would say, converging interest in everybody's. Let's take an example. Today we see more and more cities, for example, playing a very important role in the mobility. In the past, it was quite easy. You had public transportation, but most people would imagine mobility or private mobility, individual mobility as having a car and moving with their car. Today, the cities have all defined their own objectives in terms of people welfare, but also in terms of environment, in terms of sustainability, what I call the 3S sustainability of environment, sustainability of economy, and sustainability of the finance of the city. So I think today there is this convergence of interest of all the players, and nobody can imagine anymore that we will develop any new forms of mobility that will not contribute to the complete decarbonization of our society. I think that's very important. So we have to work together, all the different players, and we, Dassault Systèmes, we have to provide the tools, and particularly digital twin, in which people can imagine and create those new forms of mobility. And so it's a change in paradigm. And we have seen with COVID that what we thought would take years to build a hospital, to simulate, I would say, the flow of circulation of a virus in the building, to create a new vaccine. In reality, we were able to do it in months, and in a much, or even in days, in a much shorter time.
Now, obviously, we're well aware with the measurements of tailpipe emissions, but entire life cycle footprints where you're actually looking at logistics, materials, manufacturing, and so on, and recycling as well. But how can all of these other factors actually be measured? And a question that's actually come in, which is sort of relevant to this, is how can it be audited to ensure that everybody is doing what they say they're going to do?
I think, Fredrika was talking about transparency. I think transparency is very important. And transparency means we are all talking with the same, I would say, the same, what we call source of truth, or the same reference of data, so that, we are telling the truth. But when we talk about sustainability and this big challenge that we all have, if you think about mobility, it's not just technology of the vehicle. We are talking, or the consumption or the CO2 emission from uh, uh, the tailpipe, or in the case of electric vehicle, from the production of electricity or the kilowatt hour. We are talking about the entire ecosystem, because if we want to go to zero emission, we'll have to play on the source of energy, the storage, transportation of energy, the technology of the vehicle, the manufacturing of the vehicle, and the usage. I mean, if you put 5 people in a car, basically you are going to emit 5 times less than if you only have one person in a car. And those new usage of mobility are as important as the production of the energy, as the transportation, as the storage, as the production of the vehicle. Because when I used to work for 3 different car makers in the product planning development area. At that time, we were really much focusing on the technology of the vehicle, trying to reduce, I would say, the consumption of the vehicle, or to reduce the emission of the vehicle. Now, but that was, I don't want to say it was easy, it was difficult, but it was a relatively low hanging fruit as a result. Now, if we really want to go to zero, we have to use much more sophisticated tools. That's the point, in a transparent manner, and we have to consider the entire ecosystem of. I want to provide mobility to people who already have mobility today, but to the 2/3 of the world that today don't have access to mobility. And to do that, I have to consider. So we have those tools. You can imagine in a virtual twin not only the object, but the entire, I would say, production of energy, to production of the vehicle, to consumption, to life cycle, and recycling of the vehicle. And you can make all the different scenarios you want. We have access to big database. We can use a lot of artificial intelligence that will provide all the solutions. Say, okay, if you choose this scenario, that scenario, that will be the cost, that will be the weight, that will be the impact from an environmental basis. And that's very important to do it in a virtual twin, to do it upfront, so that we make the right decision from the beginning, because we don't have the luxury to test all the possibilities in the real world.
Erica, just tell us a little bit about what you do, and why you think the focus on just the CO2 footprint is flawed, and why we really should be looking at the much bigger picture.
Flawed, I mean, okay, I come at this issue from the raw materials perspective, and I definitely say that the focus on life cycle CO2 is just not enough, but it's an excellent starting point. And I think it's important to mention something Fredrika didn't say, because she's probably too modest, but at the time when EVs were under, I'd say, bad faith attacks on the CO2 credentials versus, internal combustion vehicles, Polestar actually had the courage of releasing their both methodology and the LCA for CO2, including not being afraid of showing that the batteries or manufacturing phase associated with EV manufacturing tends to be higher than the internal combustion vehicles. And that is, that's kind of where my area or my lens on this issue becomes relevant. And that has to do with raw materials. When you started your question, Amanda, by saying why it's flawed, I'd say it's partial. It's a great start. But if you're talking about climate change impacts and you're using raw materials that take land and overlaying ecosystems to access, we also need to be looking at disrupted carbon sinks as well as carbon sequestration services. That should also be part of the kind of the issues we're looking at from an OEM perspective. And just to give you, and there are quite a few more that come from, with the joys of mining sector or the challenges of the mining sector, I'd say. If you look at battery metals, and kind of I'm most familiar with nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese. on average, in direct kind of life cycle CO2 emissions, you're looking at 10 to 20 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of battery metal. It can be much higher, but on average, across these metals is about that. It can be 10 times more in disrupted carbon and carbon sequestration services. It also triggers 400 kilograms on average of waste per kilogram of battery metal. Some of that waste is toxic and has to be kept for indefinite periods of time. It also causes, on average, 300 liters of freshwater reserves to be used. We can do something about all of these issues, but I guess my thesis would be life cycle CO2 emissions from operations, fantastic start. Let's expand that lens to also make sure, we don't drown in waste streams, run out of fresh water, and, lose unnecessarily a lot of forests and carbon sinks. That would be my take on that.
Yeah, Fredrika.
Sorry, I need so much, Erika. I thank you for shouting out regarding our LCA. The LCA is also a perfect tool to measure all of these environmental impacts and also taking social impacts also. So, we have the possibility to actually make decisions based on all of these very important criteria. And I think that this is where we really now have to be aware of what you're talking about, really taking that into account. And when we build tools and when we build ways of working now in a powerful way with assessing and trying to impact the CO2 emissions, at the same time, take this knowledge and awareness about all of the other environmental impact into account and create that, integrate that from the start. I think it's so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If I may, I think, when I was talking about change in paradigm, you have the change in what I call the scope, the speed and the scale. So I talked already about the speed of change, but when you talk about scope, it's not anymore about I buy a car and after, I don't know, a few years, I just scrap the car and buy a new one. It's really going to be, I am a user of mobility, and how do I remanufacture? How do I reuse? How do I recycle? Not only me, but when it's a fleet of vehicle, I think the idea of durability, the idea of quality, the idea of dependability are becoming completely different, because then you are not talking to one person who is going to, I would say, invest a big amount, but you're talking about a completely different life expectancy of the vehicle, maybe depending on which part of the vehicle, what update you need to do. So I think we have to reinvent completely the entire way we are designing first mobility experience, and then the vehicle or the object that are going to help it. And then we are going to open doors to really new possibilities.
And what are the other tools then that you think are going to be necessary? Obviously, you can talk about the LCAs, but what else can we use? Guillaume?
Me?
Yes.
I think that basically what Dassault Systèmes today, what we are doing in the automotive and in other automotive, we are creating a digital twin of the real world, and then we are starting imagining all the different solutions, how I'm designing, how I'm imagining, how I'm collaborating, how I'm bringing all the players of all the players of this ecosystem, and then together we are building new scenarios in which we can measure, I think, what Erika was saying in terms of impact on all the different elements of the environment, whether it's water, whether it's air quality, whether it's CO2 emission, and so on. And you can in real time see what are going to be the impact of the different scenario you are building. And that's And that's something that you can do, and that all the players will have to take into consideration, because eventually the client, whether they are cities, companies, or individual, they will consider first the sustainability of the mobility solution. So you will have to be able to, in a very more and more transparent manner, to say, okay, my mobility solution has that impact. So if you don't take it into consideration from the early beginning and during the entire design life cycle, you are going to be excluded from the market de facto, from whichever the market is, investors, cities, regulators, customers. So I think you have to use those tools, and the only tools and as I said earlier, beyond the low hanging fruit, now it's going to be more and more sophisticated, because you will have to consider, where do the material come from, what type of material, what is my production process, and I will have to consider everything, because if you don't consider it yourself, other people will do it for you, and it might be too late for you.
Erica, a question that's come in, very relevant for you. Is the EU and the USA prepared to invest the trillions into the mining sector like China has to date, if not much of their own EV ambition might not be realised?
Yeah, that is indeed a very good question. China has been incredibly strategic for several decades in terms of consolidating their grip on the battery, both raw material supply chain as well as downstream. So a lot of the critical battery metals are coming either from China, kind of Chinese controlled mines outside of China, or then you're looking at processing capacity in China. So there's a lot of talk both in the EU as well as in the US or North America broadly, about mineral independence. I think we've gone through a phase of energy independence, and now we're trying to figure out, if you look at some of the geopolitics of some of the critical minerals, the concentration in terms of top 3 producing countries is even higher for critical minerals than it is for oil and gas, for example. So mineral independence is definitely top of the agenda. The issue is, what are you able to do about that? Because deposits are where they are. I would argue there are a couple of exceptions, and I guess our company is working on one such exception, which is located in international waters and has a lot of mobility in terms of where we can, or freedom in terms of where we could take the minerals for processing. And it could be in the US, it could be in the EU, unlike many land-based minerals, that don't have that luxury. But it's a real issue. And I think, to be honest, having been in many conversations with governments on both sides of the Atlantic, I don't think the gravity of the problem ahead has really fully sunk in. Because people, I think for the next 10 to 20 years, that could be as big as energy independence issue has been, in prior decades. I think we're a little bit out of habit of investing into mining projects. And nobody it's one thing to have them somewhere else. Nobody wants them in your backyard because of the destruction that comes with it. So it's going to be a very interesting space to watch. I mean, obviously, we think we have not ideal, but a better solution to that problem, by tapping a very different type of resource. But it's getting governments to invest in the mining industry and support projects that have lower life cycle footprints is definitely going to be a challenge.
Fredrika, did you want to jump in there with anything?
Oh yeah, but it's just such an interesting topic that we are discussing a lot also, and where I think that circularity also will play a big part in really, finding a way for not only companies, but maybe also region government to extract minerals from electronic waste. So that is also, of course, a hot topic, and where we see that we see very interesting regulation and legislation coming in, and also activity from industries. So that also gives me a lot of hope.
Now you mentioned also.
Now you start having those databases that are providing you the more detail and really the source of or the impact on the environment, depending on the choice you make, where and what type of material and what recyclability, whether it's recycled or not. I think, and those database connected with our tool give the choice to the designer to make I would say an informed decision where he wants to go and what choice he wants to make. And sustainability is going to become very, very important criteria for decision.
Fredrika, going back to the Polestar Zero, which sort of ties into that point as well. How do you harmonise communication of CO2 footprints?
Well, we think it can be done, harmonizing how we really talk to the consumers about the carbon footprint of cars and other products. I mean, people often claim that there is no standard on how to do LCA. That there are actually standards that you can use, and there are guidelines like GHG protocol for how you calculate. That is not the problem. The problem is that companies are not willing to share their methodology and share their data. So we put out a call to action last fall to simply just as a first step in creating harmonization and a more clear communication towards car consumers, to simply start showing your methodology, just putting it out there for everyone to be able to scrutinize and see. And that is what we did with our life cycle assessment, looking at the carbon footprint. And it was a joy to see how it created reactions from all kinds of people and experts in the industry. A lot of LCA experts, EV nerds, of course, really challenging us on our assumptions and ways of calculating. But in the end, we felt like our conservative approach and our really integrity was it was seen and appreciated. So that felt good. But now we will, of course, develop this methodology even more. And like Erica said, take other environmental impacts into account in the same way as we do on carbon. So that would be really interesting. And for us, and also talking about tools, and this will be a way for us to really come in with sustainability as an attribute in the same way that the industry has been really used to working with quality or cost or other attributes on cars, and really make constraints in the projects. So for Polestar Zero, we have this huge constraint, right? Zero carbon footprint cradle to gate. That's what this project should deliver. And then we will have to talk about cost and quality and how it looks and who uses it and so on. So I think that's a new mindset that we are really trying to apply to everything we do at Polestar.
And final question, I'd like to get a couple more in if there's time, but how do we better communicate this to consumers? It's all well and good talking about what the industry can do from their side, but obviously we need consumers to buy into all of this as well. Because for the most part, I think they're just confused about what they should be doing. And worst case scenario is that they're just ambivalent about the whole thing because they're just bombarded with information. So what do you all think? Erica, do you want to take that first of all?
Yeah, no, that's a tricky one, especially, again, if you take my raw materials lens, there's not, we've kind of exported mining activity from the developed, mostly to the developing world. So a lot of the impacts are, in grandfather's memories, rather than lived experience for many people today. And it's messy and it's complex. And you need to understand a lot to make sense of it. So it's definitely not the easiest issue to get people to care. On the other hand, I think, we seem to have moved on towards, shared sense of urgency around, needing to regenerate and rebuild and redesign. So, I always hope that, you kind of need to balance, you need to face the reality. This is what happens today. And, you have images and videos and kind of more, I guess, emotive way to reach people. Obviously has worked for many issues in the past. But then combining it with, this is what we can do and this is what consumer choice can, the role consumer choice can play. And I think, electric vehicles in particular is, I guess, homes aside, is the second biggest consumer product. So people tend to put a little more thought in that purchase than, maybe a laptop or a phone. So I do think this is a great opportunity to get people more exposed to, this specific vehicle you're about to buy, has, here are all the mountain of waste and CO2 and toxicity and human health consequences this has versus this, I think maybe if we start helping visualizing, for people, for EV buyers at least, what it is that they're buying. They're buying the car and deforestation or not. They're buying this car and child labor or not. I think we kind of need to bring it down to that level, I suppose. Yeah, that's the best I've got. I mean, we've struggled with that ourselves, honestly.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much to my panel. We have run out of time. There's lots more questions that I had and lots more questions that you've sent as well. I hope you've enjoyed everything that you've heard. Don't forget you can stay tuned. Coming up after the break, Joe Miller is going to be talking about how OEMs need to prepare for upcoming sweeping regulatory changes. So be sure to join him then. Thank you, and from all of us, goodbye.